This week, I honestly didn't even want to do the show. I think that I'm getting a little bit fearful about this all, but I'm just saying, whatever. We're diving in. We're getting into it. Okay, this is the deep dive. This is tailor-made podcast, baby. Let's get it. Okay. I was 7 years old, sitting in a sterile office across from a therapist, my mother beside me. It was a cycle, months of being in limbo, shuttling back and forth between my father's house and hers. She was fighting, praying, and hoping that the courts would see us placed back in her care. We never were. But there was one appointment that lives in my memory with perfect haunting clarity. My mother kept repeating the same phrase on the drive home, as if she were trying to solve a riddle. You're out of reality. What does that even mean? You're out of reality. To the doctor, that label was a box. He saw a quiet, 6-year-old girl who wasn't playing, wasn't performing, and wasn't present by his clinical standards. He saw a child who was unresponsive, so he diagnosed me as detached. He thought I was stupid, or at the very least, unaware. But here's the truth that the doctor missed. I wasn't out of reality. I was the only person in the room who was entirely too in touch with it. The doctor was operating from a baseline of normal development, a world where children were supposed to be expansive and loud. But my reality, it required me to be small. It required me to be silent. It required me to be a hunter of information, because I had learned that silence was the only way to stay safe. When you are taught that your safety depends on your ability to disappear, you don't become unaware, you become hyper aware. I saw everything. I heard everything. I recorded every shift in tone, every flicker of emotion, every hidden danger in the room. That doctor didn't see a child who was lost. He saw a child who was unnervingly observant, and his own inability to understand my silence, his own discomfort with my stillness, became my diagnosis. That was the birth of a misconception that has followed me my entire life. The idea that my quietness is a deficit, that my observation is a lack of intelligence. Life at my dad's house in Gaylord wasn't about being a child. It was about surviving the space you were allotted. We lived in a blue house directly across from the beach. It was the kind of place that should have felt like a playground. My dad's boss owned the private beach house right across the street, and we had the run of the shack and the water. But you can't enjoy the beach when your entire world has been shrunk down to a fold-out cot. For a year straight, Cassie and I lived in that living room. If you've ever slept on one of those cheap metal frame cots, you know the drill. The springs are unforgiving and the padding is a joke. Your butt hits the hard ground every time you sit down. Oh my gosh, I said that so wrong. Your butt hits the hard ground every time you sit down. That was our bed. One thin blanket, one pillow, and the cold reality that while the rest of the house had actual bedrooms and real mattresses, we were the furniture in the living room. Life at my dad's house in Gaylord wasn't about being a child. It was about surviving the space you were allotted. We lived in a blue house directly across from the beach. It was the kind of place that should have felt like a playground. My dad's boss owned the private beach house right across the street, and we had the run of the shack and the water. But you can't enjoy the beach when your entire world has been shrunk down to a fold-out cot. For a year straight, Cassie and I lived in that living room. If you've ever slept in one of those cheap metal frame cots, you know the drill. The springs are unforgiving and the padding is a joke. Your butt hits the hard ground every time you sit down. That was our bed. one thin blanket, one pillow, and the cold reality that while the rest of the house had actual bedrooms and real mattresses, we were the furniture in the living room. My dad's girlfriend, Jenny, and we're using that name to protect her, okay? But yeah, so these are all like fake names. Jenny wasn't interested in being a mother to us. When she did speak, it was just to issue a command or to be cruel. I remember one day when I had the flu, I was small, shaking, and burning up. She dragged us to Walmart anyways. I told her over and over that I didn't feel good. I was begging for the bathroom, but she didn't move until it was too late. I remember the sound of it, the shame of being sick all over that linoleum floor while people walked by. Brianna was even worse. Imagine evil stepsisters from Cinderella rolled into one person. That was her. She made sure I knew exactly where I stood in their hierarchy. But the real ache wasn't the floor or the flu. It was the hollow space where my mom used to be. Being ripped away from her was like losing a limb I didn't know I could live without. She was my entire world, the center of my orbit. It didn't make sense. How could the person I love more than my own life, more than I loved anybody else, be the same person who couldn't keep me? That's the sting that never really leaves. When I was living with her, I hardly saw her, but when I was taken away and only allowed those weekend visits, that's when she showed up. She was out of rehab, finally pouring every ounce of her soul into the short hours we had together. She was reaching for me, trying to pull us back together, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. I allowed myself to believe we were heading toward a brighter future. I didn't know then that I was just walking into the next phase of the wreckage. Then came the wedding at Beaver Creek Resort. Everything about it was perfect, too perfect. The ceremony was on the private beach across from our house, and the after party was in the cabins. Looking back, I don't think that the location was a coincidence. It felt like a pointed, silent fuck you from Jenny to my mother. It was the exact kind of dream wedding my mom had just had with her husband, Todd. It felt like my dad was trying to overwrite history. For Jenny's wedding, I tried so hard to just be a good daughter and find some joy in seeing my dad happy. I loved him. I loved him so much it ached. He passed away on December 7th, 2022, and I am still angry at him for the choices he made and for the life he pushed me into. But the anger and the love live in the same room. I'll carry both until the day we meet again in heaven. That wedding day, though, the sky seemed to be rejecting the ceremony. A tornado watch turned into a warning, and by the time the night hit, a small tornado had actually touched down nearby. We had to all huddle in the shelter, terrified, the air thick with tension and the sound of the wind screaming outside. It was fitting, really. My world was already a wreckage. It only made sense that the sky would fall in too. We were all huddled together, pretending that a marriage certificate could hold us together while the pressure outside was literally trying to tear the earth apart. After the wedding, we moved again, settling into a house in downtown Gaylord. It was a beautiful 2-story place, but it was hollow. Even as a kid, I remember doing the math. How does a chef at Gobbler's afford 4 bedrooms, a huge living room, and that kind of life? The numbers never added up. I eventually realized that the foundation of that house wasn't built on his work. It was built on what he took. My grandmother, Noreen, was the architect of my family's real legacy. Diagnosed with diabetes at age 11, she spent her life researching the disease and became one of the very first people in America to undergo a successful pancreas transplant. She was a pioneer. but the system failed her. The medication that was meant to sustain her post-surgery caused a cascade of devastating complications. She fought for her life in a courtroom and won a massive settlement. That money, that blood and sweat survival fund, was meant to protect us. She set up trust funds for all three of us girls to ensure we had a future, just like she'd spent her life supporting her own parents. But in that house, that money wasn't seen as a lifeline. It was seen as a resource to be plundered. And make no mistake, Jenny wasn't some bystander watching the money vanish. She was the driving force of the greed. She wanted us gone. Her goal was systematic: empty out our trust funds, spend every cent on our own children, and then just ship me off to Kansas City. She wanted to erase the original family entirely, to clear the board so only her kids remained. She wasn't just a stepmother, she was a predator in the house, constantly looking for ways to get rid of me so she wouldn't have to look at the living proof of the life my dad had before her. My grandmother was a creator. Noreen lived by a philosophy I still carry: go instead where there is no path and leave a trail. They were women who built things. They left legacies, her and my grandmother. But in that downtown house, surrounded by stolen money and women who couldn't wait to ship me away, the only thing being built was a trap. My father let it happen, and Jenny made sure it stayed efficient. They didn't just steal the money. They were trying to steal mine and my sister's places in this world. That house in downtown Gaylord, that was the turning point. That's where the mask finally slipped and everything changed. The boys were given their own bedrooms, but my stepsister and I, we were shoved into one room. Only it wasn't a shared space. It was her bedroom. I was just an intruder in her territory. She had a princess bed, a giant dresser, and a pile of toys that took up every inch of available space. I had a backpack and an air mattress I had to blow up every night and deflate every morning. I wasn't living there, I was just camping out in her life. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was treated like a princess, the pampered favorite with the canopy bed and the dresser overflowing with toys. But at night, the fantasy fell apart. She snored so loud it sounded like a construction site. She'd hook herself up to a breathing machine and strap on that headgear and just lay there on my I'd just lay there on my air mattress watching her. I couldn't help but laugh. If she was going to spend her days being mean and nasty, I figured it was the only fitting thing that she looked the part at night too. It was my only small victory in a room where I was clearly just an intruder. The tension wasn't just about the room. It was about the control. She was 2 years older than me, and she had these My Little Pet Shop toys that she had long gone since outgrown. They were just sitting there collecting dust. She didn't touch them, and she didn't play with them, but she would never, ever let me near them. I'd ask to play, and if she said yes, it was only on her terms, playing exactly what she wanted. It wasn't about the toys, it was about power. She just didn't want me to have them. After a year of living on that floor, I reached a breaking point. I didn't have toys, I didn't have much of anything. So the day before a weekend visit with my mother, I did something I knew I shouldn't. I stuffed a handful of those My Little Pet Shop toys into my bag. And let's be honest, actually, I took a lot of her stuff. Like, I think it was like an entire bag full of her toys because I was just like, I was mad at her. I was also really young, like I'm not a thief, but in that moment I was. Anyways, I also took 3 of my little brother's toys I know he didn't use and that I genuinely liked. I wasn't just stealing, I was reclaiming a little bit of joy after a year of being bullied. That night, Jenny went through my bag. She pulled the toys out and demanded to know if I'd taken them. I owned it. I told her I did. I expected the worst. But then my little brother walked in. He looked at me, and he didn't see a thief. He saw his sister. He just smiled and said, "It's okay, Taylor. You can keep my toy. I don't need it, and I have plenty." I'll never forget those words. Even though my whole world was being torn apart and I was surrounded by people who wanted me gone, he was there, offering me what little he did have. I feel bad about taking the toys. It wasn't my character, and I know I was wrong. But that moment, that was the first time in a long time I felt seen. I was just a little girl who had finally had enough. And in that sea of cruelty, he was the only one who didn't try to make me feel small. It was 75 and sunny, September of 2009. The northern Michigan classroom smelled like a fresh start. A sharp tang of pencil shavings from the wall-mounted sharpener and the medicinal citrus of sanitized linoleum. Cursive letters marched across a poster on the wall, watching over us. I adjusted my white ruffles, my fingers tracing the twisted metal emblem on the purple string necklace my mother had given me. My palms were sweaty. The necklace was a small weight of before against my chest as I stepped into my after. I scanned the name tags, my heart thumping until I saw it, Taylor. As I sat down, I saw a boy named Jack across from me, a tiny burst of red hair already in his seat. Then she walked in. When Valerie took her seat and said hello, the tightness in my chest from the move, the new house, and the new siblings finally loosened. She had bright blonde hair and a glowing face. And I shot her a smile that felt like it reached all the way back to my mom's house. That was the day we became best friends. Our friendship lasted for about 18 years. A lifetime, really. It carried me through a lot of stuff. But a few months ago, after I had Yori, a lot of things started to click into place. Patterns I had let slide, moments I had overlooked, they suddenly became impossible to ignore. I couldn't let them go this time. But that is a story for later in the book. For now, that first day is just the memory of a door opening when I thought I was permanently locked out. We were at my aunt's house. I had gone upstairs to sleep in her room, but the sound of yelling dragged me out of bed. It was that familiar, frantic vibration of a fight. My mother and my grandmother. Their voices sharp and red-faced on the front porch. I stood there in the dark, hating the sound of it, thinking, not again. Why does it always have to be like this? My grandmother was trying to force my mother to see the truth about my sister, to understand who she actually was, a lesbian. My mother wasn't listening. She was fighting, deflecting, lost in her own refusal to hear the reality right in front of her. I crept back upstairs, my heart hammering. I crawled into bed. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for the storm to pass. Then, the world just stopped. The shouting, the chaos. It didn't just end, it vanished. It went deathly silent. Then came the scream. My aunt shrieking for someone to call the police, the raw terror in her voice splintering the air. "Oh my God, what did you do?" My mother's voice followed, shaking, panicked, insisting she hadn't touched her. The sound of their sobbing, a deep, rhythmic agony, drifted through the walls. I went halfway down the stairs, peering through the wooden rails, looking out of that porch. I saw my aunt frantically trying to shield her daughter, my cousin, from the sight. She didn't want her to see it. She didn't want her to see that my grandmother was dead. She died of a heart attack. In the blink of an eye, the family fractured. 95% of them blamed my mother for what had happened on that porch. She didn't fight back. She didn't stay. She packed her bags and left Michigan and us for good. I was 9 years old when she gave up. I remember the day I got the call. I was back in the house in downtown Gaylord, and my mother was on the other end of the line. She told me she was moving to Kalamazoo with her new husband, Todd. She was taking the puppy Scooby, and she was leaving the rest of the wreckage behind. She never said goodbye. That was the moment I shattered. I knew with this kind of clarity a child shouldn't have that she wasn't coming back. Even now, years later, I still carry that hope in the back of my throat. That maybe she'd finally choose me. That she'd finally reach back. A few years ago, I even offered her a place to stay with me, a chance to rebuild, and she said no. To this day, I can still sorry. To this day, I can still feel the physical sensation of that abandonment. It isn't a memory, it's a living thing. It's the silence that followed the scream and the realization that the person I love more than life had simply decided that life was better without me in it. My grandmother's funeral was the last time I really saw my mother before she vanished to Kalamazoo. That day wasn't just a funeral, it was the moment the family's heartbeat stopped. My grandmother was the glue. She was the one who pulled us together for every holiday, especially Easter, which was always our favorite. But once she was buried, the family didn't just drift, we fractured. They stopped coming over, the traditions died with her, and the distance between us turned into a permanent divide. Suddenly, being my mother's daughter meant I was collateral damage in their anger. I remember the silence of those holidays. I remember having to drag myself through the mud on my own. Nobody was there to pull me out. It's a complicated legacy, though. My grandmother was a beautiful, kind woman by the time I knew her, but she was also a severe alcoholic who carried a lifetime of violence on her hands. To understand my mother, you have to understand the soil she was planted in. My aunts, my uncles, and my mother grew up in the heart of Detroit on Mount Elliott and 7 Mile, back in the 60s and 70s. They were poor as dirt, raised in a chaotic landscape where you had to fight for every inch of territory just to survive. The rumors were that the oldest aunt and my mother, the baby of the family, got to stay at a house in Roseville while the others were left in Detroit to fend for themselves, stealing food just to keep them from starving. I think their survival is heroic. They aren't perfect, but they came out of that fire with their lives, and for that, I have a deep respect for all of them. But the cost of that survival was high. When I was 14, my aunt told me a story that still haunts me to this day. She told me about being a little girl in the Detroit house, terrified of the woman downstairs. Her mother was in the living room drinking and watching TV, and the sound of a footstep was enough to trigger a beating. She was so thirsty, so desperate for water, but she was paralyzed by fear. She didn't dare walk past that living room to the kitchen. So she went to the bathroom, dipped a shoe into the toilet, and drank from it. Just a little girl forced to choose between the toilet and her mother's rage. My grandmother caught her, of course, and the result was the same. She whooped her anyways. That was the cycle. That was the frequency they were vibrating at long before I was even born. My grandmother was a victim of her own demons, who then turned into a predator for her own children. And my mother, she was just the one next in line, inheriting a heart full of trauma and a hand she didn't know how to use for anything but destruction. When my grandmother died on that porch, she didn't just take her life with her. She took the only thing that had been holding all those jagged, broken pieces together. But this didn't start with my mother, and it didn't start with my grandma. You have to go back further into the architecture of the bloodline. This was generational. It was passed down from parent to child like an inheritance, because that is how familiar spirits work. They ride the bloodline, generation after generation, looking for a place to attach to. You look at my great-grandparents, Arvilla and Vernon, and you see the origin of the rot. Everyone who ever spoke Arvilla's name had the same look in their eyes, pure hatred. She was a mean, cold woman who died the same year I was born in 97. She wasn't just cruel. She was deep into things she had no business touching. The word has it that she was into witchcraft, and she didn't hide it. Then there was Vernon. He was a DPD officer back in the 30s, right here in Detroit. But he didn't retire, he was forced out. I've been digging into the archives, into the history of that man, and there is a dark, buried story that you all need to stick around for. They were running their own operation. They had a still in the basement during Prohibition, pumping out illegal liquor, and Arvilla was notorious for it. She'd go to the blind pigs, the mob-run speakeasies, and dance on the countertops while the city burned around them. And my grandmother, her and her siblings were just kids, and they were fed that poison straight from the still. That was their normal. That's the bloodline I came from. A line of people who were raised on terror and fed on poison. When my grandmother died on that porch, she took the only thing that kept the rage in check. My mother didn't just lose her mom. She lost her anchor. A month later, she packed her bags, took the dog, and moved to Kalamazoo. She left us there, and for 5 years, I didn't see her. Then, another decade of silence. People always want to point fingers. They want to say it was my mother's fault that my grandmother died that night. That's the stress of the fighting, the screaming, the sheer intensity of the conflict pushed her over the edge. And look, maybe if that fight hadn't have happened right then, she would have had another day, another week, maybe even a little more time. But the truth is, her heart was already fighting a losing battle. She had diabetes, blood clots, and a lifetime of serious health issues that had been eating away at her for years. I don't think it's fair to put full weight of her death on my mother's shoulders. But I also know that the chaos was the catalyst. It was the final, heavy drop that broke the seal.